Goodwill gone wrong or thinly veiled prejudice? A Duke University professor advised her Chinese students to speak English 100% on campus or face unintended consequences. What's the story? And China reportedly slashed almost $78 million from Cameroon's debt, but a Chinese language report by the Wall Street Journal put the number to $5.2 billion. Why the discrepancy? You're watching The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. After sparking outcry over advising students to commit to using English 100% of the time on campus, a Duke University professor has stepped down from her post and issued an apology. Dr. Megan Neely, who had been the university's director of graduate studies in the biostatistics department, told the program students in an email Friday only to speak English in professional settings. She warned that not speaking English could lead to, quote, unintended consequences, claiming that two faculty members complained to her about a group of students speaking Chinese very loudly in a common area. The faculty members asked to see photos of the first and second year students so that they could remember them if the students ever interviewed for an internship or asked to work with them for a master's project. The email quickly spread over social media, and the controversy stretched far beyond the ivory towers of the U.S.'s universities. Was the email an act of goodwill gone wrong, or a sinister glimpse into the bias dwelling at high learning institutions in the U.S.? Joining me for the discussion in the Beijing studio is Professor Jinzhao from the Beijing Foreign Studies University, and from Hong Kong, Professor David Law, Sir Y.K. Pao Chair in Public Law at the University of Hong Kong. Welcome to both of you to The Point. Now, as I said, the professor Dr. Neely sent out this email to her students saying that there are these two faculty members who have complained about Chinese students speaking very loud in common areas, and they wanted to take their names by recognizing their headshots so that in the future, if they're interviewing these students for internship or master's program, they probably would not take these students. So in this letter, Dr. Neely said to international students, please, please, please keep these unintended consequences in mind when you choose to speak in Chinese in the building. I encourage you to commit to using English 100% of the time when you're in HOC, meaning a school building or any other professional setting. I would like to go to Professor Li first from the Beijing Foreign Studies University. When you hear such a letter, when you read such a letter, what do you make of the intention of this professor, and also the kind of feelings that she has led to?
Thank you, Liu Xin, for having me here tonight. My first reaction when I heard this was, haha, it's happening again. Because it reminds me instantly this theory called intergroup contact theory. It actually says more contact, more trouble. So this shows that as Chinese students are attending American higher education institutions in increasing higher numbers, there will be more problems of these intergroup, intercultural barriers.
Do you think that Dr. Neely was being racist, or was she just handling it wrong?
I'm willing to believe that it is goodwill gone wrong. As a university professor myself, I can imagine sometimes my patience can wear thin if I see students repeatedly having similar problems. But I think her problem, she does have some, she has some mistake. I think her mistake is she is not being sensitive enough to this kind of intercultural potential in conflict, in cultural misunderstanding. And her problem is that she singled out Chinese, the language. If she's just reminding the students that out of courtesy of all the others using the common area, you should keep your voice low when you talk to each other during your break time. that would be fine.
Mm-hmm. Professor Law, what is your first reaction? How would you characterize her behavior? Is it thinly veiled prejudice? And I would say maybe she is not even aware of this kind of prejudice. That is one possibility, but some people have also accused her of being racist, because this is not the first time she has sent out such a letter. Actually, last year, in February 2018, she sent out a very similar letter to the students saying, bottom line, continuing this practice, meaning speaking English in school buildings during breaks among the Chinese students, may make it harder for you, meaning Chinese students, and future international students to get research opportunities while in the program. Professor Law, what do you make of this kind of content and the way she puts it forward?
Well, you know, there's that expression, don't shoot the messenger, right? We could try to psychoanalyze Dr. Neely. My guess is that she acted with good intentions. What we really should be asking ourselves is how we got to a state where so many faculty, not just Dr. Neely, but she was speaking for her colleagues and even her department chair, could not realize how this would come across to Chinese students. That's the real problem. How could it be that in this elite university, right, these are the most educated, most liberal people, they would not realize that they don't ask themselves questions like, well, if these were white students speaking French or German, would we have had the same reaction? My guess is no. My guess is if you speak to most, many, if not most, people who are Asian and have grown up in North America, they probably have some story to share with you of having been stereotyped in some way on the basis of language. They may have been assumed not to speak English well, or perhaps they may have been told not to speak English in public. I've had that said to me, in fact.
So you're saying it is racism?
Well, people react very poorly when you describe the behavior as racism. I think that the people who are doing this haven't thought about how this comes across and what the effect is on the minority that they're dealing with. Now, in reality, the people who are affected by this really are Chinese students. There's been experimental research shown, for example, I mean, there is, whether people realize it or not, minority students get different responses than people who are in the majority. There's been experimental research done showing, for example, that when students email professors, if they have Chinese names or black names or Latino names rather than white names, they're less likely to receive a response from the professor. Now, this is unconscious bias, which is why people respond poorly when they're told they're being racist. But it is still bias. It's not deliberate, but it's there. And the valuable thing about this is that this is forcing us to have a conversation about bias, even on the part of people who have good intentions.
Yeah, I think it is important that we discuss this. By the way, it is also very interesting. Actually, Chinese students represent 36 of the 55 students in Duke's Biostatistics Master's program, and Chinese scholars represent 1/5 of the program's roughly 50 faculty members. So out of the 8,500 total students, 1,300 come from China. So in some cases, the Chinese students are actually majority students in the classroom. I do understand the concern of some people, however, that you are in an American university where everything is being taught, you know, a lot of subjects are being taught in English. However, is it logical to say, if you guys are chatting among yourselves in Chinese, then you probably are not speaking English very well, or you're not trying to learn English, or you don't care about learning English? I just don't see how that kind of logic flows here, Professor Lee.
Well, probably because of my background. My background is in English language and literature, and I also had experience studying abroad. So when I was a graduate student, I tried my best to try to speak English 100% of the time, but it's really, really hard. Really,
but even with your friends during breaks, would you also do that?
No, with my Chinese friends, definitely we would automatically switch to Chinese. But if we were speaking in Chinese, and if another American student joins our discussion, we will immediately switch back to English.
This is a very interesting scenario. So if someone joins you in a conversation, you would switch to the common language of the group. But if you're in a common area, for instance, you're in a kitchen area or in a canteen where everybody's eating among themselves, what should be the what is the right thing to do? Professor Law here.
Well, I think we have to understand that people are not on and at work 24 hours a day, right? At some point, we have to be able to relax and be ourselves. And if you're from China, you know, that is going to mean speaking Chinese when you're among other Chinese students. I think a natural tendency, I believe the research supports, is that people tend to switch to the language of the person they're speaking with. They're trying to be helpful. I certainly do that myself. If I'm speaking to an English speaker, I switch to English. If I'm speaking to a Mandarin speaker, I naturally switch to Mandarin. And I think that certainly it's within the university's right and responsibility to say, look, there are classroom settings, educational settings where you need to be using the common language of instruction. That's fair. But what we saw here went well beyond that, where you had a significant number of faculty complaining about a language that students were using in social settings in the break room. It's difficult to see the educational justification for that.
Right. And also, I think maybe there is also a factor, the way how she communicated what she wanted to say. Because, Professor Lee.
I think she's mixing two things. Is she complaining students speaking Mandarin Chinese, or is she complaining students talking too loudly?
Well, she said there are two faculty members who complain about it, and she consistently hear people complain about it, and both things, that they're speaking Chinese in their breaks in common areas, and they're being very loud.
Yeah, so I think there is the problem is this juxtaposing of two things. If you conflict the two things, then you are forming a kind of stereotype. That is, Chinese always talking very loudly. So that is very problematic, and that can be very hurtful to a lot of many other Chinese students who do not talk very loudly. So if you consider Chinese students as a homogeneous group who all tend to talk very loudly, then and then she brings that with unintended consequences. There will be I think that the implication was way beyond her expectation.
Well, I think it is normal. I acknowledge that a lot of Chinese people speak very loud, right? Chinese tourists or Chinese students, it's very possible. I think that is not nice when you have other people in the room. I would say, is there any other way to handle this situation, Professor Law? For instance, if you hear complaint about some Chinese speaking too loud among themselves or not speaking enough English, what would you do? Would you write a letter and send it to everybody, or maybe you would go and tell these students, look, you know, this doesn't work, you guys have to change? What would be a better way to deal with the situation concerning the Chinese students?
Well, I think, first of all, purely from her perspective, it was a bit of a blunder, obviously, to put this in writing where this could be circulated. One thing she could have done first was to, as the other professor suggested, to separate the noise issue from the language issue. Because I think people understand if you say, look, people are speaking too loudly in the break room, could you keep the volume down? I don't think that would have ignited on social media. So that's one thing that could have been done. The second thing that could have been done, now, this is a big burden to place on an assistant professor placed in the position of director of graduate studies, which in my experience is not a position that people usually want. It's a lot of extra unpaid responsibility, and she's a junior professor, and we're asking her, but she has to do this, to go to not just to the students, but also the colleagues and ask, look, what exactly is your concern? And to think about how your complaints will sound to these Chinese students who frankly feel that they're on their own time, they're talking to their friends, and why can't they use their own language? Might this look racist to them? And likewise, to take the faculty concerns to the students and see if some mutual understanding is possible. But that's a lot to ask of this assistant professor in this situation. And so again, I think it's important, rather than focusing on her in particular and what mistakes she made, ask ourselves, how did we get to the point where faculty at a university like Duke don't realize?
Let's remember, Professor Law. I have to wrap this up, but I do think we need to say we have 360,000 Chinese students studying in the United States. That is just a huge number. I hope every student is eager to learn, is industrious, is polite, and everything. That's just not going to happen. And I think both sides need to put themselves on the other side, others' shoes, and try to approach try to come to the most harmonious relationship possible. I really have to leave it there. If you don't mind, I'm going to wrap it up. Many thanks to Professor Li Jinzhao from Beijing Foreign Studies University and from Hong Kong, Professor David Law, Sir Y.K. Pao Chair in Public Law at the University of Hong Kong.